Hello and welcome to another episode of Modern Infrastructure Wednesday. I'm your host, Lee Zen. We'll be finishing the third part of our multi-part series on building a modern web application. The first two parts we covered were standing up a static React website that we hosted on API Gateway. That was in part one. And then in part two, we actually connected that to an API in API Gateway, where we're just making a very simple call. And then in today's episode, we'll be covering the last part where we're going to take that API and instead actually change it to read and write from a DynamoDB table, and then update our code to actually read and write against the API as well. So let's get started. Just as a refresher, this is kind of where we left off last time. Last time we made this API path, and we had it as just a simple GET request that returns back a simple JSON value, which is just this hello world status. And then if we go to the actual application code, you can see we actually call the API here in this fetch data call, and then that's reflected via the state here. And so if we go visit the site, when we hit refresh, it calls the API and it gets back hello world, as we would expect. And so today, we're going to go ahead and add to this example by adding a table. So let's keep this open here. And so we're going to create a DynamoDB table for us to persist data into. So we'll just do a simple counter, I guess. And so we'll just call this DDB table. And this will be a new DynamoDB table. And a table has to have attributes and a hash key. Basically, that's the minimum set of things you really need. So we'll have a really simple thing here. We'll give it an ID, and that'll be a string type. And then that'll be the key. And then you'll just give it some simple capacity, I guess. Actually, I think these are per second, if I recall correctly. So we just give it 1 to 1. All right. It's actually that simple to create a table. And so now we're going to write some code to actually talk to the table. So we'll create two paths. We'll have this get path. So we'll call this, and we'll also create a post path for the same thing. So we can post against API, we can get against API. And so get, for now, we won't touch this, but let's update actually, maybe we'll actually make this simpler. Otherwise we'll have to end up changing our application code to do two different things. Let's keep this as a get. And let's actually just do everything in here. So let's first have a client so we can talk to the table. And we'll use the SDK, which actually is part of. So actually, one of the cool things about the way Pulumi works is you can see here, even though AWS here is actually the Pulumi provider, you can quickly alias into the SDK itself. So you can see here AWS SDK. And then I can actually just go ahead and new up my client here as well. So I can just do this. And then I can let's try to fetch the value of that particular counter. So we'll just do const, let's call it data, and we're going to get a particular key here. And so what we're going to try to get is the table name, and that table name is going to be the DDB table dot name. And here we actually will already know the name, since this will have been in the serialized version. So we can do this, and then we can give it a key, and here it's going to be just counter. And then we'll say consistent read. And the idea here is that we want to have a strongly consistent read, obviously, since we're using this as a counter. And so this should give us back the table data. And then we will just get the value out of it. So and we'll have a count, basically. So so this is the row, effectively, in our table. And so here we should be able to do this. This is an any, so this is actually count. Oops, what am I doing? Okay, so basically this is either, we either have the count or we have nothing. Okay, and that's actually like most of the code, and then finally we're just going to put back the counter. And so we can just await on the client. Oops, this is data. And now we can put back into this particular table. So we can do table, and again we can use this. So actually, rip this out and just call it. And do this here. All right, and we're gonna put the item back where, again, we use the same ID. So actually, let's make this a constant as well. All right, and we can just give it this, and you'll notice that this particular field count is not defined at all in the table above. Like we have ID, but we don't have count. And this is one of the nice things about using a NoSQL store is you can, it's not necessarily constrained by the schema, right? So we can put that item back in and make this a promise. All right, and then finally we can return back the count that we got, right? So we can actually return back. Let's call this count, and give it back the count. Okay, so I think I got most of this right. Let's see. Last time you watched last episode, I made a bunch of mistakes actually getting the API hooked up correctly, just because of some odd issues I had with some caching and stuff like that. So hopefully this just works. So let's see what we changed. We're updating the function, which is going to in turn cascade down to updating the API with changing the deployment, and then also you can see I actually we detect that we need the permissions to change so that I can actually write to this table as well. So, all right, that supposedly worked. Let's do a curl on that API here. So we can do a curl of Pulumi stack output API URL / API. I believe that's my path. Yep. Let's see what this gives us. Okay, great. So that worked. 0. And now let's try it again. I should get 1. Okay, good. So it's working. So the API works as we expected. It's basically, it lets me do a get against this, and then now it executes this handler function, which talks to the table, gets the actual value from the table for this particular item, and then puts it back with a +1. So now let's go to our app, and all we have to do is actually just change this a little bit. Here we have this fetch API, which is exactly what we're already doing here. Down here I have this status.status thing, and that's a little bit wrong because now what we actually have to do is here I set the status to this s.json, and that's not quite what we want to do, right? So now what we actually want is to we can actually still do this. I guess we're just putting the JSON object in there, but now this is actually, the value here is going to be, the thing is called count. So let's call this count, and we'll just change this to counter, so it's actually a little clearer what we're doing. And let's go to app, and we will rebuild this. Oops, what did I do here? Cannot find. No, I wonder if this is because I copied some stuff around earlier, so I wonder if I just forgot to install the packages here as I did last time. So let's do that. And as soon as this is done, yes, React is not a small dev environment, certainly. All right, hope I can do yarn build now. All right. So yeah, I mean, if we go, you know, we didn't have to change the app too much, and let's go back down here, and we'll Pulumi up. So if we look back at our infrastructure code, you know, very simple. We added this table, and then we just modified the existing API function we had to do these read writes. You can totally imagine doing what I was thinking about doing, which is splitting it out into a get and a post separately, and then changing the app itself to here have two different effects, right? One to do the get and one to do the post. But really, for the purposes of the example, no big difference, so I decided not to do that. You can also imagine, since this is all real code, very easy to refactor. So let's go back here, let's refresh, and now we have a counter of 2. So that's pretty much what we expected to happen. If I refresh again, then 3. So it's working as expected. And now we've actually completed the whole tutorial, and if you want to call it that. We started off in the first episode just getting the React site up with the API Gateway. And then last episode, as I mentioned, we just put together a super simple API. And then today, we finished it off by actually introducing some persistent state store and then actually changing our API to read and write from that store. So there you go. A basic example of what you might see in a modern web app. And then, of course, you know, if you were to go build something like this yourself, you would actually make the site pretty and do all this other stuff, you know, in terms of what the actual functionality you wanted to do was. And then, of course, making your API shaped like the API that you would want. And then, of course, having your actual business logic in here as well. But hopefully that gives you a gist of how easy it is to build a modern web app with React using Pulumi on top of AWS. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And for future episodes, please subscribe and like the video. Feel free to leave comments, suggestions for future episodes as well. Follow us on Twitter. And as always, we'll see you next time. Thanks very much.